Well, welcome everyone who is listening live to this really intriguing topic that we have today on integrating the Gen Z cohort into our workplace populations. And for those of you who are on the line, if you have questions, you can pop them into the chat section, and Lindsay will intercept them and see if any of them are things that we want to make sure that we bring up. Otherwise, for those of you who are listening later, thank you for taking the time to tune in. This is one of those, I think, really contemporary topics. At Tiara, we try to stay tuned into what are our clients concerned about. And this topic actually came up because we had clients that we were coaching who were saying, I'm finding myself struggling a bit with how to manage the ins and outs of working with the Gen Z population. It's not all good, it's not all bad, but I'm not quite sure what's the best way as they enter our workforce and are physically with us. What's the best way of working with them? They're posing some new and different kinds of challenges. And so we took that on and said, well, that sounds like it's something that has value. And let's, really talk about that and see if we can get some folks who can help us in understanding what is really going on. And not only just okay, here's what it is, but what are some strategies and some simple ways of taking full advantage of the strengths of Gen Z and at the same time supporting them in making this, for many of them, this first entree into a professional role or their professional full-time workforce environment. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. And before we go any farther, I do want to get us started by introducing our panel. So first, and if everyone's probably not in the same order as on my screen, but I will go ahead and introduce Lindsay Wynn. And Lindsay is, what's interesting for me, Lindsay, about you is that you've been in Digitas for 14 years. So you really see the landscape of not just, I can see how this is impacting the organization I'm in, but you can see what's transpired over the last 14 years and have a really interesting kind of objective perspective on what's going on in the world of work as it relates to Gen Z. And Lindsay is the Vice President Director of Talent Development at Digitas. So she intercedes with, everyone and all the challenges they're having in developing talent. And that's a piece of it, is how do we develop the Gen Z talent, and how might they be different, and what do we need to take full advantage of in trying to develop them? So welcome, Lindsay, and thank you so much for joining us today. And then I want to introduce Ilka Erkan. I should be calling her Dr. Erkan because she's a PhD in microengineering. And she's really, a global citizen in so many respects. Grew up in Istanbul, has studied in the States, was here for 10 years doing her graduate work, and is now back at the University of Delft in the Netherlands as a professor in microengineering. So she deals, what was so interesting when we talked is that she deals primarily with two populations: the boomers who are on the cusp of retiring, and the Gen Z students coming in the door. And so you can imagine the kind of stark contrast that you might see if those were the two sets of cohorts that you interface with the most frequently. So welcome, Ilka, and thank you so much again for joining us at a different hour of the day, by the way, with a 6-hour time difference. And then we have Melissa Thornley, and Melissa has a wealth of experience in the creative industries, advertising, TV production, all kinds of different things, and then turned her skills at working with people and influencing people into becoming an emotional intelligence consultant and an executive coach. And Melissa, how long have you been coaching? It feels like 15 or more years now.
Yeah, since 2008.
Yeah. So like 16 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and she coaches people and works with organizations in every imaginable kind of both function and service or or product that they produce. So this is not, sort of one slice of an industry. This is really a great cross section of the kinds of clients that you work with. So you bring a really unique perspective because I think your view is really broad in terms of being able to see like where the red thread goes through, various different industries, and yet it feels the same in terms of what people are doing. And the last person I'll introduce is Sydney Alderson. And Sydney is a brave soul in that she is a Gen Z. So we recruited Sydney to join us today to add the Gen Z perspective. So that we actually weren't just talking about Gen Z, but we also had that representation here on the panel. So Sydney is a licensed clinical social worker, and she works in a therapeutic environment, but she brings other work experience, having done some work at Chicago Booth, University of Chicago Booth Business School. So she's seen a lot of her colleagues, if you will, her cohort in action in lots of different ways. So Sydney, thank you for being courageous and stepping into this dialogue with us. We really appreciate that. And I'm Peg Rowe, and I'm going to be the facilitator. I'm a managing partner for Tierra, also known as Lead True. And so I'll be facilitating our dialogue today with these really distinguished women who are joining us and have such a great wealth of experience. So I thought before we got too far along, I would just do a quick reminder of what these generational bands are. We hear the terms thrown around all the time and sometimes can get confused about, okay, is it Gen X and then Gen Z, or what are the different groups here? And the thing to remember about these cohorts, if you will, is what generally has them be considered one group of folks, and they span decades. So it's not like it's a single decade that we're marching through, but it's usually some kind of a significant event or set of circumstances that have them feel like they're connected. They may not have the same views, they might not have the same beliefs, but they've had a similar experience, if you will. So, for example, the traditionalists, which are pre-1945 and basically are out of the workforce now, they had a shared experience around World War II. That was something that people related to. That was one of those things that, as you could ask that question, where were you when? And that would have this commonality between them. And the next group of the baby boomers, often, it's a function of having grown up just post World War II and been part of that sort of 1960s, disruption when there were protests about everything from the Vietnam War to women's rights to racial injustice. So, we had a very socially active social justice orientation for those of us who are boomers, and I happen to be one of those. So every single one of these cohorts has usually some kind of an event or circumstances that has them be kind of in common. Those are the experiences they may have all had that were somewhat shared. So boomers generally are going from 1946 to about 1964. So you have many of that population that are, have either already retired or are right on the cusp of retiring, considering retiring. And we're experiencing boomers that are choosing not to retire right away. They may be going to work part-time, they may be slowing down, but they're not always necessarily dropping out of the workforce. And that's followed by the Gen X, which are basically 1965 through 1980. And they share a lot of the first introductions to tech. They tended to be latchkey kids. Often both parents were working. In some cases, they were being raised by a single parent. So those are some of the common experiences that they may have had. And then Gen Y are also called millennials. So you hear those two terms interchangeably. And they're between 1981 and 1995. And for many of them, as they were growing up, they shared 9/11 as a universal experience. Some were very young when that happened, but a lot were old enough to begin to understand. And they were that generation that really was much more oriented towards screen. They were the first kids who were getting computers and having computers at school, and they were much more involved in that tech world, if you will. And then Gen Z is this population that was born basically after 1996. And the thing that really is driving the kind of global universal experience for this group is the pandemic. So not only did they grow up on screens, if you will, where everything is either on their phone or on their laptop, but they also have the experience of the pandemic, which created for all of us that sense of isolation, being at home. But for this group, many of them, for example, didn't have a chance to have a high school graduation because we were in lockdowns. So they missed out on some other kinds of events that are usually milestones that most of the rest of the population had the opportunity to enjoy. So that kind of draws them all together. So, this is the sort of the link that each of them have. It's important to remember that these groups are not homogeneous. They aren't all the same. They don't all have one point of view, but they have a shared experience that may have shaped their beliefs and their attitudes. And that's often what we're dealing with. It's not like you're dealing with that event, but you're dealing with the aftermath of it in terms of whatever beliefs and attitudes are brought into the workforce. And they aren't always the same for everybody, but it's important to recognize that is an influencing factor that we don't want to necessarily ignore, because that is at the root of a lot of what we end up seeing in these groups. I am going to deviate here for a moment. Okay, you mentioned zillennials, which is a term that's being used in Europe, and I was very curious about that. So you want to share with everybody what is this cohort called the zillennials?
They define themselves as the in-between generation. Some of my Generation Z, Gen Z students who have siblings from millennials, they can empathize and they can think like millennials, but most of their friends are Gen Z. So they feel like they're kind of stuck in between, because they have qualities and attitudes towards the life from both of the generations.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because we will see this in different parts of the world. I mean, we're not, everyone doesn't always use exactly the same terminology. And zillennial is with a Z, so it's like millennial, but a Z versus an M. I looked it up, being the fact finder that I am, because I was curious. So let's talk a little bit about how these cohorts show up in the workplace. And Lindsay, I'm going to turn to you because you have identified a couple of different things that I thought were interesting. One is about the move of boomers out of advertising, which is the industry you're in. So you want to describe that environment a little bit and which groups tend to gravitate towards the work that your organization does?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have seen advertising as a very fast-moving, fast-paced world, and it is in client services. So if the client calls, you answer, and you deliver on whatever it is that they've requested. And because it's so fast, because it's long hours, because it's weekends, we are seeing a lot of boomers moving client side. So Digitas is generally skews pretty young, and I would some of our sister agencies are in the similar boat. So, I think that the folks that have kind of taken over are able to move at that fast pace and still have the energy and the interest in doing that and performing, for the client and working those nights and weekends.
Great. And Melissa, given the breadth of the work that you do, which cohorts do you find yourself coming in contact with?
All of them.
Great.
I would say the least amount nowadays is boomers, aside from the fact that, unless you go with me to book club, and then you'll find lots of boomers at my book club. But otherwise, I mostly work with Gen X and millennials. And then some of the management trainee programs that I've been working with over the past few years, those management trainee programs are all Gen Z. So I see those in cohorts, but not as often one-on-one.
Great. And it is interesting. One of the pieces of information that I gleaned, which I thought was fascinating, is they expect that by 2030, that over a third of our work population will be Gen Z. So we have a few years to figure out how to best acclimate those folks into our organizations and how our organizations can best tap into the talents of that group. But it's going to continue to grow. They're just really, beginning to enter the workforce in mass, and we're going to see that happen for probably the next 6 years or so. So I think that was kind of an interesting one. It's like any leader who says, well, maybe they'll just go away is wrong. They're here and they're going to stay. So Sydney, I know you're Gen Z, and you're kind of at the tip of the arrow. So, there are definitely Gen Zs who are younger than you. And your work environment, who are you coming in contact with?
So, I'm lucky enough that my team has a real diverse array of generations, which is nice in the therapeutic environment because,
Yeah.
for example, the boomers on my team have been doing this a lot longer, so I have a lot to learn. Because generally in therapy, it's mostly millennials and Gen Z is in my experience. But working at Booth, I was the odd one out. I feel like most of my team was
Mhm.
Gen X and boomers.
Okay, great. So, and we already mentioned that Elka has, both ends of the spectrum, but not a lot in between, which is an interesting and different kind of challenge. So I think that's the other thing I wanted to point out is that everybody's environment reflects different cohorts. And so that requires us, I think, as leaders to be conscious of and aware so that we are able to support the workplace in the way that we want to as leaders. So Lindsay, I'm going to start with you in terms of what are you seeing? What is your experience of Gen Z in the workplace? What are the things that they're bringing? What are the ways that they are entering the workforce, and, what's occurring as a result of that?
Sure. Gen Z is very unique. And we are seeing a lot of trends, I think, as they do kind of come into our world. One of them is communication. I think that that's a big one. Their communication styles are very different. A lot of emojis, a lot of texts. There is, I think this dynamic between folks that have been, previous generations not understanding why there has to be emojis and all these messages. And I think one of the big, pieces there is that Gen Z is very authentic. They believe in bringing their whole selves to work and not changing or code switching there just to kind of deal with the previous generation. So that is a different thing that's rocking the boat, I think, is big, is that communication style and just how they work as far as bringing that authenticity being so important to them.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things that have been brought out, particularly for Gen Zs who were in college as the pandemic hit, is that meant that in many cases where they might have had the opportunities to do more teamwork and more collaborative work, that while there was an ability to do that virtually, it wasn't quite the same as being in person. Do you see that in your workplace, that this, lack of, sort of FaceTime teamwork has any impact on how they team within the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. It has come up. I think we're back in the office 3 days a week for the most part at our agency, and so there is more opportunities for face to face. I think that is something that our Gen Z population likes. They want to socialize. They want to get together in conference rooms and brainstorm and work together. So I think collaboration looks different at this generation, but is it wrong or is it just different? And that's something that we're trying to kind of work out as a company to understand the differences there and be able to use them to our advantage instead of kind of pushing back on them.
Right. Yes. Lindsay, Melissa, what do you hear reported from your clients in terms of how Gen Z shows up and just what they're experiencing as this group is entering the workforce?
It's interesting. So I also work in higher ed. And it's with a tech university or university focused on STEM, and one of the things does point to social emotional skills. So now we were seeing that prior to the pandemic, and the
Yeah.
pandemic then worsened it. And it's basically because we are so reliant on our phones for communication that things are
Mhm.
planned in advance. So, okay, I'm going to text you and we will get together, but we are not going to just walk through the quad and hang out and then meet up with friends at the student union, like that sort of in the interspersed intermittent type of social communication isn't necessarily happening as much, or it wasn't happening for them as much. And so they are very tech focused. So they do see the technology as driving the results as opposed to the interaction driving the result. And the reliance on that technology for answers as opposed to generating the answers themselves or doing the research themselves. So, for example, they might not necessarily have basic business etiquette skills that we would just assume. We would automatically assume them to know a certain protocol, say for an email thread, how to reply to an email thread in a timely way, or how to interact with a client or a manager or a peer in a timely way. We might have an assumption of what that looks like. And so it puts on everybody around, everybody else around them to sort of understand, was I actually clear and crisp in my communication with them? When I said XYZ, was I very plain? Was I direct about it? Because if you're not necessarily direct or plain in how you're speaking, then it might go unmissed because you are assuming that they are reading between the lines. And there's no reason actually for them to read between the lines because you haven't said the thing that you meant to say because you assumed that they knew. So it seems like there are some threads that whether, millennial through boomer, we might have some cultural threads that we automatically make assumptions around.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
we can't make assumptions.
Right.
We have to be clear. Yeah.
I'm going to throw it back to Lindsay since you brought up the business etiquette and communication, because you have a great example of how that can show up for exactly the reason that you're mentioning, Melissa, just an assumption that people already have some of those basic skills walking in the door. So Lindsay, if you don't mind, it was such a great example.
Sure. Yeah. Recently, I was working with an early careerist, and they needed to get CFO approval. And I was talking this individual through the process, and I gave some guidance on how to kind of write the email. When I saw it come through, I was definitely surprised with the casualness that this individual used, emojis, nice to meet you, multiple exclamation points to our CFO. And while it got the job done, she got approval. I was shocked. It wasn't necessarily how I would have communicated to our CFO or still continue to communicate to our CFO. So that was definitely a very blinding example to me about how different their communication style is.
Yeah. Ilka, what do you see showing up in education from your perspective?
I totally agree. We also see the same attitude in communication, and what we ended up doing this year in our introduction to electrical engineering course, before we dive into all the mathematical, technical, and coding related details, we give them an overview of this is how you write an email to your professor. We just try to give them a perspective of how many people that we're dealing with, how many different courses we're teaching. So at least now there's a template that everybody is using, which course they're in, what is their student number. But the funny thing is, I think they're also incorporating now ChatGPT related tools to write. Literally, these templates are just like popping up in my inbox, like, okay. Sometimes I have some Teams messages with a subject written possibly from ChatGPT. I was like, okay, all right. So they're at least following the template without looking into, without trying to making any effort to make it natural. But this is also very interesting for me, what we have observed in terms of their tech saviness. We were always looking at Gen Z as like, oh yeah, they're so tech savvy. They're great. And like, we're trying to catch up with them. But then for the first time last year, we were a bit shocked by this. In one of the digital electronics courses, we provide them with a set of template codes that they're going to be working on. And we send them a zip file. And we realized for the first time ever, our students do not have any idea how to unzip a file because they've always been working on their laptops, or not their own laptops, but mostly on their tablets and their like phones. So we had to tell them, no, zip, you cannot unzip on your tablet. You have to go to a PC. Please do that. So this year we actually have how to unzip a file in our lectures.
I love this because what it's pointing to, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, is when we get to the question of, great, so we know all these things, now what do we do about it? So clearly, Melissa, to the point you raised, training and being tuned into not deficiencies, but what are the differences that in order for someone to be successful, we want to make sure that we've equipped them with the kinds of guidelines and templates and, awareness and guidance as to how they want to proceed. They're not unwilling to do that, but it's just not in their repertoire. And so we don't have to, we need to be careful not to assume that it's a resistance not to do it, and actually move over to the side of, oh, okay, this is just an area that I need to share with them. They haven't had to do this in the past, so this is perhaps something new. So Sydney, as a Gen Z, what are you observing about your colleague cohorts at this point? Okay, I think you're frozen. So turn off your video and then see if you can speak with us.
Yeah, I would everything that has been shared. I've
Turn your video off.
Can you hear me
There
now?
we go. Thank you.
Okay. How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
This is so funny because we're talking about how Gen Z is supposed to be so tech savvy, right? And here I am. I am the only one having issues with Zoom, which again, as Peg was saying earlier, I'm very familiar with, given I had to do grad school virtually throughout the pandemic. But yes, I am seeing, as I was telling Peg last week, I generally see in my cohort a fearlessness when it comes to technology. I think there are things that have slipped through the cracks that are common practice for the generations that have come before, like unzipping a file or, CCing on an email, things like that. But once I've seen my cohort figure out that they're missing this information, they're very brave and they go online and are very willing to self-teach using the internet, using AI. And so that's something I've noticed is a fearlessness with the cohort.
Great. So one of the things that each of you mentioned in some form when we talked was that this group is much more self-aware. They are much more connected to their feelings and willing to talk about feelings, that they are also using language around life balance, which we typically were not hearing before. And the other piece of that falls into that category is a desire on their part to have some form of balance and boundaries. And I think in many cases, this feels a little bit unique. We're more accustomed to people getting their first job and being anxious to prove themselves and being willing to do whatever it takes. And this particular group is much more tuned into, how they want work to fit with the rest of their lives. So I'm interested, Lindsay, in what you get in the way of feedback. What is it that you hear, and what do you see your leaders kind of bumping up against and finding a little bit of a struggle in terms of the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this generation is working to live versus living to work. And it's certainly come up a lot. I think our chief talent officer at the end of last year brought an observation to us about timesheet data. And our VPs were spending a lot more time just on their timesheets. It was coming through, and it was not being filtered down to the folks below them. So we talked about, is this delegation? And I think that it's a combination of things, but a lot of it is this boundary setting that Gen Z has. And they are, hired and believe that they are going to be working 40 hours a week and aren't really rearing to go longer than that. And certainly previous generations have just worked as long and hard as they can to, get the next promotion. Whereas we're seeing now Gen Z is ready to be promoted after 8 months. They're ready to go. And so I think a lot of what we're dealing with is kind of resetting those expectations and, trying to be clear about the fact that they're hired to complete a task or to complete a series of tasks, not necessarily to work only 40 hours. So I think boundary setting is really important, but we are trying to be a little bit more clear about,
Right.
The expectations around when and how to set those boundaries.
Yeah, I think this is another example of having someone come in, being clear in their mind, like they're working 40 hours a week and that's a boundary for them. And so they're shocked at the idea they're supposed to work longer hours, and a leader who's shocked at someone challenging that this is what we need to do to meet the client's needs. So, you have both sets of groups kind of bumping up against an assumption set that has them be like, wow, that was not what I expected at all. Okay, it shows up for you as students in a different way. And you were talking about, typically the students that you work with in the past would have had ambition towards advanced degrees and been planning towards that. And you're not seeing that as much this today because people are a bit more focused perhaps on getting the years in to earn their retirement. You want to speak to that a little bit? Because I think that's a unique perspective in Europe.
Yeah, this is something that was very surprising for me when I first arrived in the Netherlands and started to look into my students' like next steps, what is motivating them. And what I see is that they are swinging between two ends of the spectrum, I would say. So on the one hand, we have some Gen Z students who are not concerned about being a part of the workforce just yet. They want to explore, they want to take their time, but they want to just check off certain things. They want to get this degree first and then maybe try out something else. They have all these things lined up. So this was on the contrary to what I was used to, where like most of the students were, I need to finish as soon as I can so that I can start working. So this was a bit of a surprise, but then I also saw, especially in the technical fields, I have seen some students who have broad range of interest, who are interested in interdisciplinary work, and they can maybe, instead of in the Netherlands, the undergraduate education is 3 years. So instead of 3 years, they can make it 4 and maybe take more courses that will give them more options for grad school. But they were baffled by the idea of not graduating in 3 years, but 4, not because of that 1 year or like that delay, but that would also mean that they're going to be a part of the workforce 1 year later, which is going to mean that it's going to have some implications for their retirement, that they're not going to have as much savings. And then I was like, wait, you are 21 and you're thinking about your retirement already? I'm like, I'm 40 and even I'm not thinking that much about my retirement or not making my choices just yet, let's say. So that was a bit of a surprise for me to see that one group of Gen Zs, they're pretty relaxed and they're just like, all right, we're just gonna explore. And another group of Gen Zs, they're like, no, like if we lose 1 year now, it's going to be another year like in retirement loss. We can't afford that. I was like, okay, this is an interesting discrepancy.
Yes. And what I love also is it points out that they don't all think alike. It's that they've had a shared experience, but how they approach life as a result of it might be very, very different, which is kind of interesting. So we've talked a bit about some of their strengths in terms of they are very much more self-aware. I love the idea that, Lindsay, that you're observing that people are really looking forward to working together, and this idea of collaboration looks different, but yet is something that they are not resistant to at all. and they have this tech savviness. And yet we know that somehow we may be missing the mark a bit by focusing on the things that are challenging around the boundary setting and, the work ethic. Those are things that in a couple of the things that I read, those are often cited as the irritants that leaders have, is that this group, it doesn't appear to have the same openness to accountability. They are not as open to working hard to get the job done, and that there is, a desire for, a stop and a start that feels much more accountable for them. So how do we leverage their strengths? And part of what I'm thinking is technology. How do we leverage technology to support solving some of these issues? Lindsay, one of the things you mentioned is that some of the Gen Zs will identify that they don't want to do menial work. They really just want to do the really creative, interesting work. And yet it made me wonder, if they have the tech skills, maybe there's what is being considered for them menial work, but it's just routine that hasn't been challenged before. And maybe their skill set in technology could actually be used to leverage, streamlining things for everybody that would benefit the whole organization.
Yeah, I think that that's something that we would encourage our leaders to explore more. They do have this set of areas of opportunity, but they do have this great strength, and that zip files aside, they're pretty tech savvy. So how can they use that to our advantage? How can they maybe refine processes using these various technologies so that there is more free time to kind of do more of the things that they're interested in the more creative side. So that's something that I think we'll explore, and Digitas is definitely at the forefront of AI and all the capabilities that AI has or is continuing to build even as we speak. So I think that that's something that will be beneficial, is having them, we actually have an AI mentoring program, which I found out about yesterday. So there's some folks who aren't super excited about jumping into AI and understanding what it is. Some folks are really interested in it. So there's this mentoring match that's happening here at Digitas. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. And I'm sure that there are plenty of Gen Zs ready to mentor folks along that journey.
Great. And one of the other things that you mentioned was, because of the differences as they're coming into the organization and the assumptions that have been made in the past, it's actually requiring your leaders to provide more ready feedback earlier in the process. What are you thinking around how to support leaders in providing that kind of feedback that in the past they haven't had to do as much?
Yeah, we're really focusing, I think we're always focused on feedback. I think that that's something that we can always get better at in general. We're finding that Gen Z is really they have kind of like two driving factors. They like the understanding. They want their manager to be understanding of their priorities and their boundaries, and they want acknowledgments. And there are times when we want our managers to be really specific about feedback and talking a lot about impact. And that's something that myself and my team are trying to drive often, is that, it's not just, don't tell them not to use emojis. That's not helpful to them. That they don't understand that. So what does the emojis, what's the impact of you using an emoji to our chief financial officer? What does that mean for your brand? And as well, they're not thrilled about the fact that they have a personal brand. Everyone has one, right? If you see someone's name, you a couple of words come to your mind about who they are and whether you want to work with them. So that's something that we're trying to kind of push that understanding and push that impact for. And I think that, hopefully that's something that resonates with them instead of just saying, no, it's no because. So that's something that certainly we're looking to do more with in 2025 and beyond.
And that leads nicely, Melissa, into some of your thought process and some of the work you've done to support leaders in helping them, again, understand Gen Zs and use particularly in this world of accountability, which we understand for some Gen Zs makes them bristle. They have almost like an allergic reaction to the word accountability, although they're not necessarily unwilling to be accountable. There's something about that word that has a different impact on them. How are you working with leaders to have them really understand Gen Z and then turn that understanding into a positive that they can then use in helping to encourage them to work within the organization in a way that's more effective?
Yeah, I love what Lindsay was saying about impact,
Mhm.
about personal brand. So when we look to Gen Z, one thing that we can definitely count on is their focus on purpose and values and how they are showing up, right? Because
Mhm.
everybody has TikTok or Instagram or their
Right.
some type of social media where they are showing up in a certain way. They follow influencers. So being able to talk to them and say, hey, how do you want to be influencing those around you? What are your values? What is your purpose? How are you putting that into action? And then helping them then draw the dotted line from, okay,
Mhm.
if I want to show up as ready and prepared for that next promotion because I want to get closer to my retirement or I want a raise or I want whatever their motivation is, right? If this is how you want to be perceived, then what do you think the next steps? What do you think that looks like in terms of your email communication or the quantity or the quality of communication over Slack or um, some other DM app, right? So it's looking at who do you want to be? How do you want to show up? And then what does that actually look like from a detail and have them get to see, oh, wait a minute, my perception of what this it looks like. Because so if I am the person that sends the CFO the email with all the exclamation points and the emojis, and my proposal gets okayed. I'm like, yeah, all right, okay, bring on the emojis and the exclamation
Right.
points because I got it done, and might not necessarily see that it was accomplished in spite of
Right.
in spite of it. So
Right.
yeah, so it's really connecting around values. Mhm.
And you bring out another point that it's important after the fact when that happens to circle back and help the individual understand, yes, you got what you needed, and here was the downstream impact of that communication so they don't think, I found the secret. This is what you do,
Yeah,
and continue to do that.
exactly. And to
Right.
do that, I think in conjunction, so being on that path
Yes.
with the employee, so here's the downside to this. It
Yep.
takes time, right? So when we have VP, director level, maybe even first time managers that are managing Gen Z, they
Right.
might think to themselves, hey, wait a minute, this is going to be faster for me to do it myself. And this is something that any generation can tell you that, like, oh, just give that
Right.
to me. I'm just going to quick do it. Well, you are missing out on hours and hours, saving yourself hours and ultimately weeks and years of time if you don't take that opportunity
Right.
to step them through the process so that you understand, oh, wait a minute, they get it. Especially for Gen X and Millennial, and any of the blends, the X Millennials. Are there X Millennials out there, Ilka? You'll have to let me know. Um, but but to understand that when we went through a learning process, oftentimes we had to figure it out ourselves, and then we did it by mistake, and then through the mistakes we learned, and that process was a different process than maybe Gen Z or Zillennials had.
Right.
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 So it's not even just the task itself, it's how we actually learn may be different, and to look at how we are looking at how we are training. So not just the
Mhm.
content of the training, but the process and the
Right.
process.
Yeah, Sydney, if you're able to respond, I hope that you are. You had some other thoughts about questions that we could ask Gen Z that will give us more insight into who they are. And a couple that I noted were things like, what do you feel inspired to do? How would you like best to contribute? Are there others that could be sort of part of this conversation that Melissa is suggesting that will help us get some insight into these individuals so that we're actually, in a position to collaborate and work in more partnership, if you will, and mentor more appropriately?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's what I'm hearing both in what Lindsay and Melissa are saying is approaching it with this curiosity instead
Mhm.
of rigidity of this is how things are done. And I think that that is a brilliant approach just from what I've witnessed in my cohort. Asking them questions like, what do you feel the most confident about in your skill set right now that you want to highlight? Since a lot of us are new career, I think starting from there is really good. I think, like Peg said, asking what do you feel most inspired to own and to commit your time to is really good in asking that up front because then it creates their own accountability where they said like this is what I want my name to be a part of instead of again being told what to do. I think that's a great um way to get started when you're first. I think a lot
Great.
of this has to be set up when you're first
In the very
starting to work with
beginning.
the Gen Z.
Right. So Ilka, on this
Mhm.
topic, and then we'll sort of go into closed mode. I did love one of the ideas that you and I discussed, which was this idea of looking for the bridge builders. So the people who can create the bridges between these two groups. Would you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I actually see myself as one of the bridge builders, and I'm working towards learning from both sides actually, and I would like to acknowledge how much I'm learning from Gen Z in the process. Because most of my students are Gen Z, and I am in a managerial position where most of my employees are either boomers or millennials. So I have the great opportunity to be exposed to a wide range of, except for Gen X, as we have spoke, and I now made it a point like, how many Gen X do we have here? And we do have a few, let's say. But one of the things that we have seen, like for example, with this self-expression and like this openness of Gen Z, we see it among our students that when we have, for example, a student who is non-binary, we just share our pronouns and it's all set. And I just admire how open they are. Nobody makes a point of it. But then when I am amongst my colleagues who are boomers and who have to teach to non-binary students, they're like, who cares? Like, oh, why do I have to learn all of these pronouns? But and so it's a whole discussion. And I realized, oh my God, like we have to learn so much from Gen Z in that sense. And we're
Yeah.
trying to practice, like we're trying to put some best practices in forward in a way. For example, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, we have the Women in Engineering Initiative Affinity Group, and I am the chair of the Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands Benelux region. So as we were doing Women in Engineering initiative related work, some of the non-binary students approached us and they said like, what about us? Where do we fit in? And we were like, oops, like, what do we do now? So we ended up calling ourselves Women Plus in Engineering for the sake of like being a bit more inclusive to learn from our Gen Z students who reached out to us. And it sparks up a good conversation with our boomer colleagues too,
Yes.
hopefully integrating them to this openness a little more.
Great. So you've landed us in a place I'd like to close out on, which is have everybody say a word or two about, what your advice would be to leaders who are, bringing in effectively this group and integrating Gen Z into the workplace in a way that is a win-win and feels good for everybody. Sydney mentioned curiosity. Ilka mentioned, learning and inclusivity. Lindsay, what about you?
I would have to say just listen and hear their perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Melissa.
All of what everybody has said,
Ed?
and
Ditto, ditto,
also
ditto.
ditto, 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 and also being curious about our own behavior and being
Mm,
curious about the systems that we are in, because each generation, without fail, questions the previous generation. right? So that is a thread
Yep.
through all of them. So to not be defensive when we are questioned, to take that on as an opportunity to, oh, yeah, let's look at this for a second and let's consider it and let's do it in a collaborative way. And guess what, folks? A lot of our systems are broken. Now, we might not be able to fix those systems. And at the same time, we can acknowledge, okay, yes, and so I would, my two things are listen, not only be curious about the generations that you're working with, but be curious about our own assumptions, be curious about the systems that we're in, and then having a both and mentality to be able to really create that bridge, whether it's a bridge with the people or a bridge with the system or a bridge with the concept or idea.
Great, thank you. All right, this brings us to the end of our roundtable. I have a feeling we could have gone on for a lot longer. And so it actually has me thinking about some things around exploring this topic a little bit more, as well as delving even more into the possible solutions and strategies so that leaders feel equipped to really do their very best job as well. So I want to thank each of you for your enlightening experiences and for your wisdom and really adding, a lot of color to this conversation so that we get a real sense of what is, happening out there and what are the personal experiences that we're each having. So thanks again. And thanks to everyone who's listening either now or in the future. I'm going to leave you with one final quote and I'll read it so I don't get it wrong. It's from a gentleman named Chip Conley. He's an American hotelier, and he actually became what they called the wisdom leader, the elder, at an organization called Airbnb. When they had their first set of entrepreneurs, they reached out to him and tapped into his wisdom. And his quote that I really love is, "We have 5 generations in the workplace today. And we can operate like separate isolationist countries, or we can actually start to find a way to bridge these generational borders. And it's time for us to actually look at how to change up the physics of wisdom so that it actually flows in both directions, from old to young and young to old." And I love that we've already had references to building bridges. We've already had references to, oh, I'm learning so much from Gen Z. So, as a group, you actually represent very much of what Chip Connolly is suggesting that we need to be doing. So thank you again for bringing your ideas and your wisdom and your experience. And thanks everyone for listening. And that's all for today.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Peg. Thanks, everyone.
You bet. Thank you. Stop.